The crystal chandeliers of Lumiere cast prismatic light across white tablecloths as San Francisco's elite savored their $450 tasting menus, each course a carefully orchestrated symphony of flavor and technique. Chef Julien Moreau surveyed his domain from a kitchen doorway, his tailored chef's whites pristine despite the controlled chaos behind him, his 3 Michelin stars glinting on the wall beside framed reviews from the New York Times, Food and Wine and Bon Appetit. At 38, he built a $20 million restaurant empire through precision, discipline, and an uncompromising palate that had made him a legend in culinary circles from Paris to Tokyo. Yet tonight, like most nights recently, the accolades fell hollow. Another service, another standing ovation, another evening alone in his penthouse overlooking the bay, wondering why success tasted so much like emptiness. His fiancée, Dominique, his talented sous chef of 5 years, was more business partner than lover these days, but that seemed appropriate for a life built entirely around ambition rather than connection. In the dish pit at the back of the kitchen, 26-year-old Isabelle Chin scrubbed a copper sauté pan with the same meticulous attention she gave every task, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her second-hand sneakers squeaking on the perpetually wet tile floor. She'd been washing dishes at Lumiere for 3 months now, arriving an hour early and staying 2 hours late without extra pay, her eyes constantly tracking the movements of the line cooks, absorbing every technique, every flavor combination, every moment of genius that made Julien Moreau's food legendary. The other kitchen staff barely noticed her. Dishwashers were invisible in the restaurant hierarchy, the bottom rung earning minimum wage in a kitchen where line cooks made 6 figures and sous chefs drove luxury cars. But Isabelle wasn't here for the money or recognition. She was here to learn from the best before finally opening the neighborhood restaurant she dreamed about since watching her grandmother cook in their tiny San Francisco apartment. She had plans, credentials, and dreams that nobody in this kitchen could imagine, hidden beneath her humble position like a diamond wrapped in newspaper. Tonight would change everything for both of them, though neither Julien nor Isabelle had any idea what was coming when the evening shift began. A single comment, spoken from genuine knowledge and deep concern, would shatter Julien's carefully constructed world and set in motion events that would either destroy his empire completely or transform it into something better than he'd ever imagined possible. The truth always has a way of surfacing, even in the steam and chaos of a 3 Michelin-starred kitchen where hierarchy matters more than talent and pride matters more than honesty. And Isabelle Chin was about to discover that telling the truth to power would cost her everything she'd worked for, her job, her dignity, her chance to learn from a master, before giving her something far more valuable than she'd ever dared to dream. Sometimes the worst moments of our lives are actually doorways to the best ones, if we're brave enough to walk through the fire. Hello, my friends. Before we continue our story, leave your like, share the story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Julien stood at the pass like a conductor before an orchestra, his sharp blue eyes scanning every plate before it left the kitchen, his trained gaze catching imperfections that would be invisible to civilians, a microgreen placed carelessly, a sauce drip on the rim, a protein resting at 93 degrees instead of the perfect 95. The Saturday night service was running like clockwork, each station performing at peak efficiency, the choreography of fine dining executed with military precision by a staff that feared disappointing their chef more than anything. His signature truffle risotto with butter-poached lobster had just gone to table 12, a party that included 2 influential food bloggers with combined social media followings in the millions, and a wine importer from Napa Valley, who controlled distribution for several prestigious California wineries. He perfected this dish over 5 grueling years, using white truffles from Alba imported at $4,000 per pound, Carnaroli rice aged for exactly 18 months in climate-controlled conditions, and Maine lobster, so fresh arrived at the kitchen still moving in insulated boxes packed with seaweed. The dish had appeared in Food and Wine's 50 Best Dishes in America, earned a full-page spread in Bon Appetit, and been featured in a Wall Street Journal article about the new generation of American fine dining. It was a reason celebrities flew to San Francisco specifically for his restaurant, bypassing New York and L.A. Dominique appeared beside him at the pass, her blonde hair perfectly styled even after 6 hours in the kitchen heat, her chef's coat somehow spotless despite having worked the fish station all evening, her makeup subtle but flawless in a way that suggested she touched it up during the brief break between the dinner rush and dessert service. "Table 8 wants to meet you," she said, touching his arm with practiced intimacy that felt more choreographed and genuine. "It's the Hendersons. He's considering a $3 million investment in your New York expansion, and his wife just Instagrammed your amuse-bouche to her 500,000 followers." Julian nodded curtly, removing his apron to reveal the Tom Ford dress shirt underneath, the one he kept pristine for exactly these moments when the kitchen opened to the dining room and the chef became performer as much as cook. These moments, the recognition, the validation, the visible proof of his success, should have felt triumphant, should have filled the emptiness that had been growing inside him for the past 2 years. But lately they felt mechanical, like he was playing a role he'd written for himself long ago and no longer fully believed in. Meanwhile, back in the dish pit that most of the kitchen staff never even glanced at, Isabel stacked clean Bernard Daud plates with mechanical efficiency, her movements economical and precise despite the exhaustion that made her shoulders ache and her feet throb in her cheap shoes. But her mind wasn't on the dishes. It was processing the small taste of risotto that had splattered near her station during plating, a few grains of rice and a fragment of lobster that she'd sampled when no one was looking. The richness was overwhelming, the truffle oil drowning out the delicate sweetness of the lobster and the subtle nuttiness of the aged Parmesan, and there was no acid anywhere to cut through the fat and earthiness that coated the palate like velvet. It was technically perfect. The rice was cooked exactly al dente, the lobster was butter tender, the truffle was genuine and generously applied, but was unbalanced, like a beautiful painting composed entirely of earth tones with no contrast to make the eye understand what it was seeing. Her hands trembled slightly as she dried a Riedel wine glass that cost more than her weekly paycheck, her mind wrestling with an impossible question. Should she say something? In her 3 months here, she'd never spoken unless spoken to, had maintained the invisibility that dishwashers were expected to embrace like a uniform, had kept her knowledge and credentials hidden, because revealing them would raise questions she wasn't ready to answer. The kitchen was breaking down now as the last dessert courses went out, line cooks cleaning their stations with the same precision they applied to cooking, scrubbing cutting boards and wiping down counters, while the dishwasher, Isabel, would handle the final deep clean that would take her until nearly midnight. Julian returned from schmoozing table 8, his expression satisfied in a way that didn't quite reach his eyes. The Hendersons had verbally committed to $3 million. Plus, they'd agreed to introduce him to their network of high-net-worth individuals who might invest in the expansion to Manhattan that would make Lumiere a bi-coastal empire. He grabbed his leather messenger bag from the small office behind the kitchen, already mentally composing tomorrow's email to his business manager about moving forward with the New York lease negotiations, when he passed the dish pit and noticed something unusual. Isabel was staring at the plate she was washing, a plate that held his risotto, a few grains of rice, still clinging to the white porcelain, and her expression was troubled in a way that suggested she was seeing something that bothered her professionally. "Is there a problem with the dishware?" Julian's voice was sharp and used to anyone in that station looking at anything other than dirty dishes that needed to be cleaned, returned to service, and forgotten. Isabel jumped like she'd been shocked, nearly dropping the $200 plate, and Julian felt a flash of irritation at this interruption to his victorious evening. He'd just secured major funding, received compliments from important people, and earned himself a weekend of positive social media buzz from influencers with millions of followers. The other kitchen staff paused in their cleanup, sensing something unusual happening in the normally invisible corner of the kitchen where the dishwasher worked. The chef never spoke to dishwashers except to complain about water spots on glasses or to yell when something got broken. Isabel's heart pounded so hard she could feel in her throat, her hands still wet from the sink, and she made a decision that would change everything. She would tell him the truth about his signature dish. Consequences be damned, because staying silent would make her complicit in mediocrity. She set the plate down carefully on the rubber mat, dried her hands on her apron, and met his eyes with a directness that kitchen hierarchy absolutely forbade from someone in her position to someone in his. "Your risotto," Isabel said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "It needs more acid to balance the earthiness of the truffle. Maybe a squeeze of Meyer lemon, or finish with a white wine reduction, or even a touch of yuzu. Something bright to cut through the richness and let the sweetness of the lobster actually be tasted instead of buried." The kitchen went absolutely silent, so quiet that the hum of the walk-in cooler suddenly seemed loud. Even the exhaust fan seemed quiet as every cook, prep assistant, and sous chef turned to watch what was happening at the dish pit. Julian's face flushed red from his collar to his hairline, his jaw clenching so hard that a muscle jumped at his cheek, his hands curling into fists at his sides as he processed what had just happened. A dishwasher, someone who was paid barely above minimum wage to wash plates and take out trash, had dared to critique the signature dish that had earned him his 3rd Michelin star. Food critics had called this dish transcendent, a masterpiece of modern American cooking, and the reason fine dining still matters. And now someone who probably couldn't even afford to eat in his restaurant was telling him it was unbalanced. "Excuse me?" His voice was dangerously soft, the tone that made experienced line cooks tremble and seasoned sous chefs check their mise en place twice. "You, a dishwasher, are critiquing my risotto? A dish that has been featured in every major food publication in America? A dish that people wait 3 months to taste." Isabel's stomach dropped as she realized the magnitude of her mistake, but she couldn't take it back now. And part of her, the part that had trained in Paris, that understood flavor at a molecular level, that loved food too much to watch it be less than it could be, didn't want to take it back. Dominique appeared from the wine room where she'd been doing inventory, her eyes gleaming with something that looked disturbingly like pleasure as she assessed the situation, as she watched her fiancé confront this nobody who'd somehow caught his attention over the past few months. She'd noticed Julian watching the dishwasher sometimes when he thought no one was looking, had seen a curiosity in his expression that made Dominique's perfectly manicured nails dig half-moons into her palms, had felt a primitive territorial warning that this quiet woman represented some kind of threat to the future Dominique had so carefully constructed. "I'm sorry, chef," Isabel stammered, her professional composure cracking as the weight of the entire kitchen's attention pressed down on her like a physical force. "I just thought I could taste it when some splattered near my station, and I noticed that the balance was—" But Julian cut her off with a harsh laugh that echoed off the stainless steel surfaces and tile walls, a laugh that held no humor at all, only contempt and wounded pride. "You thought? You tasted something that splattered near your station? Dishwashers don't think here, and they certainly don't taste the food. They wash dishes. They stay in their lane. They don't pretend to understand cuisine. That took me 15 years of training to perfect." The words were designed to wound, to put her back in her place, to remind everyone present of the hierarchy that made fine dining kitchens function. Chefs at the top, dishwashers at the absolute bottom, and never shall the two worlds meet. Do you have any idea how insulting it is to have someone in your position? Someone who probably can't even pronounce carnaroli tell me how to cook? The humiliation burned through Isabel like acid, made worse because she could pronounce it perfectly, could tell him the difference between carnaroli and Vile 1 Nano and Arborio, could explain the amylose to amylopectin ratios that made each variety suitable for different preparations, could recite the entire history of risotto from its origins in 14th century Sicily to its modern interpretations. But admitting any of that would only make things worse, would reveal she'd been lying by omission about who she really was and what she really knew. "Get out," Julian said flatly, his voice cold enough to freeze helium, pulling off his Patek Philippe watch, a $40,000 timepiece that represented 5 months of what Isabel earned a year, and setting on the counter as if preparing for a physical altercation, even though his violence would only be verbal. "Clean out whatever pathetic locker you have, and get out of my kitchen. You're fired. Security will escort you out if necessary." The words hit Isabel like physical blows, each syllable a hammer strike against her chest, and she felt tears threatening despite her determination not to cry, not to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break completely. She'd known this job was temporary, had known she was gathering knowledge and experience before opening her own place, but being fired like this, being humiliated in front of 35 kitchen professionals, having her expertise dismissed and her character attacked, felt like a rejection of everything she'd worked so impossibly hard to become over the past 8 years. The other cook studiously avoided her eyes as she untied her apron with shaking hands, some looking uncomfortable with the severity of Julian's reaction, others nodding in agreement that she'd gotten exactly what she deserved for stepping so far out of line. The kitchen hierarchy was sacred, and she'd violated it in the worst possible way by suggesting the emperor might not be wearing clothes. Dominique stepped forward with a sympathetic smile, that didn't reach her cold eyes, her hand touching Julian's arm in a gesture that was equal parts comfort and possession, marking her territory in front of everyone who might have wondered about their relationship status. Julian's absolutely right. Honey, maybe this kind of high-level cuisine just isn't for you. Maybe stick to something more your speed, like Applebee's or fast food. The kitchen erupted in uncomfortable laughter, the kind of nervous chuckling that happens when people witness something cruel but feel pressured to participate in the cruelty to prove they're on the winning side. Julian didn't stop the laughter, didn't offend the woman he just destroyed with a few carefully chosen words, didn't acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, his reaction was disproportionate to her offense. Instead, he turned away, already dismissing her from his mind, already moving on to tomorrow's concerns, as if this interaction had been nothing more than swatting an irritating fly. Isabel walked to the small locker room with her head held artificially high, using every ounce of dignity she possessed to keep from sprinting away in tears, her vision blurring, as she fought against a crying that wanted to overwhelm her completely. She grabbed her small backpack from the locker, containing nothing but a change of clothes, a water bottle, 3 protein bars, and her most precious possession, a worn copy of Larousse Gastronomique that her grandmother had given her when she left for culinary school in Paris 8 years ago. The book was in French, annotated in her grandmother's careful handwriting with notes about family recipes and cooking wisdom accumulated over 70 years, and it represented everything Isabel loved about food: the history, the science, the art, the way cooking could connect generations and cultures and create beauty from simple ingredients. She held it against her chest like armor as she walked to the kitchen one last time, past the line cooks who wouldn't meet her eyes, past the sous chefs who were already gossiping about what had happened, past Julian who stood at his office door, watching her leave with an expression she couldn't quite read. Dominique stood beside him with one hand on his shoulder, her body language screaming victory, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. Isabel pushed to the back door into the San Francisco night, the cool air hitting her overheated face like a blessing, and only then did she allow herself to cry, not from shame, but from frustration at a world where being right mattered less than knowing your place. She stood in the alley behind Lumiere for 5 minutes, letting the tears come, letting herself feel the injustice of what had just happened before she forced herself to stop and think practically about next steps. Her savings account held exactly $4,300, enough for 2 months of rent in the studio apartment she shared with 2 roommates, enough to survive while she found another job. Definitely not enough to open the restaurant she'd been dreaming about for years. The culinary world was small and vindictive, and she knew that Julian Moreau's name carried enough weight to blacklist her from any serious kitchen in San Francisco if he bothered to make a phone call or 2. She'd been blacklisted before, after a catastrophic experience in Paris, and she knew exactly how it felt to have doors slam in your face because someone with power and connections decided you were a troublemaker who needed to be punished for having principles. But she also knew she was good, better than good, technically skilled and creatively talented in ways that most chefs spent their entire careers trying to achieve, and eventually someone would recognize that talent, or she'd create her own opportunity where nobody could fire her for telling the truth. Isabel pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found Teresa Martinez, the owner of Mariposa Taco Truck, who she'd met at a farmer's market 3 months ago and had stayed in touch with because Teresa reminded her of her grandmother, warm, wise, tough as nails beneath the maternal exterior. "Teresa, it's Isabel. Are you still looking for someone to help with the night shift at the truck?" She listened to Teresa's enthusiastic response, felt some of the tightness in her chest ease slightly, and agreed to start tomorrow. It wasn't a fine dining kitchen experience she'd hoped for, wasn't advancing her career toward opening her own place, but it was honest work with good people, and right now that mattered more than prestige. She walked to the bus stop on Market Street, her backpack weighing almost nothing but feeling heavier than she could bear, her mind already planning how she'd survive the setback and eventually, someday, prove that she'd been right about the risotto even if nobody wanted to hear it. The city lights blurred through her tears as the bus arrived, and she climbed aboard thinking that this was rock bottom, that things couldn't possibly get worse, having no idea that in 3 weeks everything would change in ways she couldn't begin to imagine. Back in his office, Julian sat at his desk staring at nothing. Dominique's voice a distant buzzing as she talked about the Henderson investment and tomorrow's menu meeting and the pastry chef's request for new equipment. His mind kept returning to the moment in the dish pit, to the woman's face as she'd suggested his risotto needed acid, to the certainty in her voice that suggested she actually knew what she was talking about rather than making a lucky guess. He'd spent 5 years perfecting that dish, had consulted with Italian nanas and molecular gastronomists and 3 Michelin star chefs in Europe, had tested dozens of rice varieties and truffle preparations and cooking methods. It was perfect. Everyone said so, critics and customers and fellow chefs alike. So why did her words keep echoing in his mind like an accusation? Maybe a squeeze of Meyer lemon, or finish with a white wine reduction, or even a touch of yuzu. Something bright to cut to the richness and let the sweetness of the lobster actually be tasted instead of buried. The specific suggestions bothered him most, because they weren't the random criticisms of someone who knew nothing. They were the targeted corrections of someone who understood both the problem and multiple possible solutions. Are you even listening to me? Dominique's voice cut through his thoughts, sharp with irritation, and Julian realized he'd missed whatever she'd been saying for the past several minutes. Sorry, I was just thinking about tomorrow's prep, he lied, not wanting to admit that he was still thinking about a dishwasher he'd fired, still hearing her quiet voice suggesting his signature dish was unbalanced. Dominique's eyes narrowed slightly, her intuition clearly sensing that something was off, but she let go and returned to discussing business. The profit margins from last quarter, the supply negotiations for the New York location, the upcoming charity gala, where Julian would be honored. They'd been engaged for 2 years, but still hadn't set a wedding date, and lately Julian realized he never thought about marrying her, never imagined growing old together or having children or building a life outside the restaurant. They were business partners who occasionally slept together, and that used to feel sufficient. But tonight it felt hollow in a way that made his chest ache. He looked at Dominique, beautiful, accomplished, ambitious, and felt nothing but a vague guilt that he couldn't love her the way she deserved. Julian drove home alone that night. Dominique stayed at her own apartment claiming she needed to work on costing spreadsheets, and found himself unable to sleep, his mind replaying the interaction with the dishwasher on an endless loop. He pulled up the restaurant's employee records on his laptop, finding her file. Chun, Isabel, age 26. Emergency contact, Teresa Martinez. The background check his HR company had run showed nothing interesting. No criminal record, no previous restaurant experience listed, nothing that suggested she was anything other than what she appeared to be. But something nagged at him, some instinct that there was more to her story than what appeared in the sparse 2-page file. He closed the laptop and walked to his floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the San Francisco skyline and the dark expanse of the bay beyond, wondering why success felt so much like loneliness and why he couldn't stop thinking about a woman he'd destroyed with his words just hours ago. Somewhere out there in the same city, Isabel Chun was probably sleeping, or more likely lying awake replaying the same interaction from her perspective, feeling the same confusion about why a simple truth had exploded into such devastating consequences. Neither of them knew that in 3 weeks, a review from Ruth Adler would prove Isabel right and Julian wrong, would shake his entire world to its foundation, and would set in motion a chain of events that would either destroy everything he'd built or transform into something infinitely better. 3 weeks later, Julian stood in his office reading the New York Times review for the 5th time, his hands trembling with genuine fear for the first time in his adult life, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him with the speed and finality of a controlled demolition. Ruth Adler, the most influential food critic in America, whose reviews could make or break restaurants worth tens of millions of dollars, whose opinion was treated as gospel by both industry professionals and serious diners, had visited Lumiere incognito and delivered a review that was methodically, surgically destroying everything he'd spent 15 years building. Chef Moro's signature truffle risotto, once a triumph worthy of its Michelin stars, has become a monument to excess, unbalanced, heavy, with the delicate sweetness of Maine lobster entirely obscured by overwhelming earthiness that coats the palate like mud. She'd written in prose so damning it felt almost personal. One longs for acid, for lightness, for brightness, for any indication that someone in that kitchen understands the fundamental concept of balance that separates great cooking from merely expensive cooking. The review had gone viral immediately, shared more than 50,000 times across social media platforms, with food bloggers and amateur critics and even casual diners piling on with their own previously unspoken negative experiences. Hashtag Lumiere's over was trending on Twitter. TikTok videos mocking his $450 tasting menu had millions of views, and Instagram food influencers were publicly canceling their reservations with long posts about how they'd been afraid to say anything, but had always found his food pretentious and unbalanced. The pile-on was vicious and relentless, the modern equivalent of a public stoning, and Julian watched his reputation disintegrate in real time across every screen he looked at. His phone wouldn't stop ringing, his business manager, his publicist, his lawyer, all calling with increasingly dire updates. And his email inbox had become a nightmare of investor concerns, media requests for comment, and cancellation confirmations from customers who no longer wanted to be associated with a restaurant that had been so thoroughly eviscerated by the times. His reservations had dropped 43% in just 3 days, with primetime Saturday slots, previously booked 3 months in advance, now showing embarrassing availability. The Michelin Committee had requested an urgent meeting to discuss concerns about maintaining current star status, language that made his business manager's voice shake when delivering the message because everyone in the industry knew that restaurants rarely survived Michelin downgrades. Even worse, 2 of his major investors had pulled out of the New York expansion, taking $5 million with them and leaving the project dead in the water. The Sign Manhattan leased suddenly an albatross around his neck representing $80,000 per month in rent for space he couldn't use. The Oakland Bistro and Sausalito Wine Bar, both profitable only because they rode on Lumiere's reputation, were reporting double-digit drops in business as customers avoided anything associated with the fallen Julian Moreau. His empire, valued at $20 million 3 weeks ago, was potentially worth less than $8 million now, and dropping every hour as the bad news compounded. Dominique sat across from him in the office, her usual impeccable composure fractured, her face pale and makeup smudged in a way he'd never seen before. She looked scared, genuinely terrified, and that frightened Julian more than anything else because Dominique never showed weakness. "We need to respond immediately," she said urgently, her voice tight with controlled panic. "Put out a statement, offer a new menu, do a press conference, offer refunds, something, anything, or we're going to lose everything." But Julian couldn't focus on her words because his mind kept circling back to that night 3 weeks ago, to the moment in the dish pit when a dishwasher had said almost exactly what Ruth Adler had written, had identified the precise problem he'd been too proud and too stubborn to acknowledge. "Your risotto needs more acid to balance the earthiness of the truffle. Maybe a squeeze of Meyer lemon or finish with a white wine reduction or even a touch of yuzu. Something bright to cut through the richness and let the sweetness of the lobster actually be tasted instead of buried." Those had been Isabel Chen's exact words, and Ruth Adler had essentially written the same critique, and Julian had fired the one person who tried to warn him about the problem that was now destroying his career. 2 of his best line cooks had already been poached by competitors who sensed blood in the water and were circling like sharks, offering signing bonuses and promises of stability that Julian could no longer guarantee. His executive sous chef, who'd been with him for 7 years, had quietly updated his LinkedIn profile and started taking calls from recruiters, a betrayal that hurt more than Julian wanted to admit. The landlord for the main Lumiere location had sent a carefully worded letter expressing concern about the restaurant's ability to meet its lease obligations, legalese that translated to "we're preparing for the possibility you'll default, and we'll need to find a new tenant." Julian's business manager had delivered the worst news of all earlier that morning. If they lost even 1 Michelin star, the restaurant's valuation would drop from its current $8 million to less than $3 million, making it impossible to pay back the $10 million in loans Julian had taken to expand, potentially forcing him into personal bankruptcy that would consume not just his business, but his penthouse apartment, his car, everything he owned. 15 years of work, destroyed in 3 weeks because he'd been too arrogant to listen to honest feedback. Julian found himself driving through the Mission District at midnight, unable to sleep for the 4th night in a row, unable to think about anything except finding some impossible solution to an unsolvable problem. The streets were alive with a vibrant night economy, food trucks serving late-night workers and club-goers, to carry us with lines out the door, the smell of grilled carne asada, and al pastor, and fresh tortillas filling the air with an unpretentious deliciousness that made his refined cuisine seem suddenly sterile and joyless by comparison. He'd spent his career chasing Michelin stars and food and wine awards, creating food that impressed critics and intimidated customers. And now he wondered if he'd lost sight of what cooking was supposed to be about. Not proving something or building an empire, but making people happy with delicious food. And then he saw her, Isabel Chun, standing at the window of a taco truck called Mariposa, wearing a simple black t-shirt and jeans instead of her dishwashing uniform, laughing with a customer as she handed over a paper basket of tacos, looking more relaxed and confident and genuinely happy than she'd ever looked in his kitchen. She looked different than she had at Lumiere, not diminished by her humble position, but somehow elevated, like she'd been playing a role before, and was now fully herself, comfortable in her own skin in a way that suggested this job suited her better than washing his dishes ever had. Julian parked his Tesla, one of the last remaining visible symbols of his success, though he'd probably need to sell it soon, and walked toward the truck with his heart pounding in a way that felt uncomfortably like hope mixed with shame. The closer he got, the more details he noticed. The way other workers at the truck treated her with genuine respect, the efficiency of her movements suggesting serious culinary training, the care she took in composing even simple tacos, as if presentation mattered regardless of price point. "We need to talk," he said when he reached the service window, his voice rough from days of stress and sleepless nights, and Isabel's warm smile vanished instantly as she recognized him, her expression closing off like a door slamming shut. "There's nothing to talk about, Chef Moreau," Isabel said coolly, her voice professionally polite but emotionally distant in a way that made it clear she owed him nothing and expected nothing from him. "I believe you made your position quite clear 3 weeks ago when you fired me for telling you the truth." But Julian saw something flicker in her dark eyes before she could hide it. Not anger, but a kind of sad knowledge, like she expected this all along, and was disappointed but not surprised that he'd only come looking for her now that he needed something. Teresa Martinez appeared beside Isabel, a woman in her 50s with flour on her hands and protective mothering instincts written all over her face. Clearly this woman had heard the whole story and had some opinions about Julian Moreau. "Is this man bothering you, Mija?" Teresa asked in a voice that suggested she was fully prepared to grab the metal spatula hanging nearby and defend her employee if necessary, and Julian realized with uncomfortable clarity that he was a villain in this scenario, the wealthy man who'd abused his power and was now trying to manipulate the woman he'd victimized. Isabel wiped her hands on a clean towel and stepped away from the window, gesturing for Julian to meet her at a small plastic table near the truck, her body language making it clear this conversation was a favor she didn't owe him rather than something she wanted. The smell of carne asada and fresh cilantro and caramelized onions filled the warm night air, such a dramatic contrast to the refined atmosphere of Lumiere that Julian felt disoriented, like he'd stepped into a parallel universe where the rules he understood no longer applied. "You read the Times Review?" Isabel said flatly, not phrasing as a question because they both knew exactly why he was here. "And now you're here because I was right, and Ruth Adler said almost exactly what I said, and you need me to fix the problem you were too arrogant to acknowledge when I tried to help you 3 weeks ago." Her directness shocked him. In his world, people were obsequious and careful, always managing his ego like it was an unexploded bomb. But Isabel treated him like he was just another person who'd made a mistake and needed to own it instead of making excuses. "I was wrong," Julian said, the words tasting bitter but necessary, an admission that went against everything his pride had been screaming at him for weeks. "The risotto needs acid. You were absolutely right. And now my entire restaurant, everything I built over 15 years, is falling apart because I was too proud to listen to honest criticism from someone I decided wasn't worth listening to." He explained the full scope of the disaster. The 43% drop in reservations, the $5 million in lost investment, the possibility of losing Michelin stars that would destroy his brand forever, the loans he couldn't repay if his valuation dropped any further. Isabel listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable but her eyes never leaving his face, and Julian found himself talking more honestly than he had in years, admitting fears and failures he'd never voiced to Dominique or his business manager or even himself during the long, sleepless nights when anxiety made his chest tight. "I need help. I need someone who understands flavor at a fundamental level, someone who isn't afraid to tell me the truth even when I don't want to hear it. I need you." The words hung in the warm night air between them, heavy with significance and unspoken implications. He was asking for professional help, but the vulnerability in his voice suggested he was asking for something deeper, some kind of absolution or redemption that only she could provide. Isabel stood and walked to the taco truck without responding, returning moments later with 2 paper baskets containing tacos al pastor, marinated pork with grilled pineapple, white onions, fresh cilantro, and lime wedges on the side, served on handmade corn tortillas that had been pressed and cooked to order. "Eat," she commanded with quiet authority, and Julian obeyed automatically, his body responding to the certainty in her voice the way his line cooks responded to his orders. He bit into the taco and experienced an explosion of perfectly balanced flavors that made him pause mid-chew. The rich fattiness of the pork was perfectly cut by the acid of the pineapple and lime. The cilantro added brightness and herbal notes. The onions gave bite and texture, every element supporting and enhancing the others rather than competing for attention. "This is what I tried to tell you," Isabel said quietly, watching him process the revelation happening in his mouth. Flavor isn't about expensive ingredients or Michelin star technique or impressing critics. It's about balance and harmony and making every element support the others, so the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Your risotto is technically perfect. The rice is cooked exactly right. The lobster is butter tender. The truffle is genuine and expensive, but it's unbalanced, and unbalanced food is always unsatisfying no matter how expensive the ingredients are. Julian finished the taco and reached for the second one, his mind reeling from the simplicity of her explanation and the complexity of its implications. He'd spent 15 years pursuing technical perfection and expensive ingredients, building a reputation on flawless execution and rare components. And somewhere along the way he'd forgotten that the point of cooking wasn't to impress, but to satisfy, not to prove something, but to make people happy. These $10 tacos from a truck demonstrated more understanding of fundamental flavor principles than his $450 tasting menu, and that realization was both humbling and oddly liberating. "Who are you?" Julian asked, really looking at Isabel for the first time, not at a dishwasher or an employee or even a potential solution to his problems, but at an actual person with her own story and skills and reasons for being where she was. "You're not just a dishwasher or a taco truck worker. Nobody who washes dishes talk about fundamental flavor principles or suggests Meyer lemon versus yuzu as acid alternatives. Who are you really?" Isabel smiled sadly, a complicated expression that contained loss and acceptance and a kind of weary wisdom about how the world really worked versus how it should work. She pulled out her phone and showed him a photo of a younger version of herself in pristine chef's whites, standing in front of the Le Cordon Bleu campus in Paris, her smile radiant with the confidence of someone who believed talent and hard work would be enough. "I trained at Le Cordon Bleu Paris on a full scholarship, graduated top of my class with distinction in both cuisine and pâtisserie. I was the youngest chef de partie at Restaurant Alain Ducasse in Paris, being groomed for sous chef, working under Laurent Beaumont, who everyone said was the next big thing in French cuisine." Julian's mind reeled as he processed this information. Le Cordon Bleu was one of the most prestigious culinary schools in the world. Restaurant Alain Ducasse held 3 Michelin stars, and Laurent Beaumont had indeed been a rising star until a scandal 5 years ago that Julian remembered reading about but couldn't quite recall the details of. This woman had credentials that rivaled his own, had trained at institutions he deeply respected, had worked in kitchens that would look impressive on anyone's resume, and he treated her like she was worthless, like her opinion mattered less than nothing simply because of her current job title. "What happened?" he asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know, wasn't sure he could handle another revelation that would reshape his understanding of who Isabel Chin really was. Her expression hardened, old pain surfacing in her dark eyes, and she took a moment before answering as if deciding how much truth to share with someone who'd already proven he didn't deserve her honesty. "My mentor, Chef Laurent Beaumont, was stealing wages from the immigrant workers in the kitchen, paying them half the legal rate and pocketing the difference, probably adding an extra 100,000 euros a year to his own income, while people who could barely afford rent worked 16-hour days for poverty wages," Isabel said, her voice steady but her hands curling into fists on the plastic table. "I discovered it by accident when I was helping with payroll during an administrative assistant sick leave, and I reported it to French labor authorities. I testified in court, made sure those workers got justice and back pay, did everything right according to the law and my own conscience." She'd been 23 years old, Idealistic and naive, absolutely certain that doing the right thing would be rewarded or at least respected. And for having the audacity to prioritize ethics over loyalty to my mentor, I got blacklisted from fine dining. Laurent still has powerful connections throughout the European and American culinary world, and he made sure everyone knew I was a troublemaker who couldn't be trusted, someone who betrayed her own chef, a liability no serious restaurant should hire. It didn't matter that I'd been protecting vulnerable workers from wage theft. All that mattered was that I'd broken the code of kitchen omerta by reporting a chef to outside authorities. She'd spend the next 3 years applying to every serious restaurant she could find, in Paris, London, New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and getting rejected over and over because Lauren's Whisper network was thorough and vindictive. She'd worked in mediocre restaurants that were happy to hire someone with her skills for bargain wages, had saved every penny she could, and eventually made her way to San Francisco with a plan to open her own neighborhood restaurant where she'd be accountable to customers and her own conscience rather than the powerful men who treated ethics as optional. So I work where I can, save money, and plan for the day when I can open my own place where nobody can fire me for having principles or telling the truth. The bitterness in her voice was earned, the result of years of being punished for doing the right thing, and Julien felt ashamed of his industry, of himself, of the way he perpetuated the same toxic power dynamics that had destroyed her career. She'd tried to help him, had risked the humble job she needed to survive by giving him honest feedback, and he responded by publicly humiliating and firing her, proving that she'd been right all along about how chefs with power treat people they view as beneath them. They talked until nearly 2 a.m, sitting at the plastic table near the taco truck, while the city slowly quieted around them, Isabel explaining her vision for a neighborhood restaurant that would serve elevated comfort food at prices normal people could afford. $25 entrees instead of $75, $50 tasting menus instead of $4.50, good food that made people happy rather than intimidated them or made them feel inadequate for not understanding French. Culinary terminology. Julien found himself fascinated not just by her technical knowledge, which was clearly formidable and perhaps superior to his own, but by her philosophy of food as community builder, nourishment, connection, accessibility rather than status symbol or vehicle for culinary ego. Food should make people happy, she said with simple conviction, not intimidate them or make them feel poor or unsophisticated. That's what I want to create, a place where a working-class family can celebrate a birthday without maxing out credit cards, where good ingredients and good technique produce comfort rather than anxiety about which fork to use. Julien thought about his own restaurant, about the couples he'd observed splitting one dessert because they clearly stretched their budget to eat at Lumiere, about the way his staff treated anyone who didn't have perfect French pronunciation or wine knowledge with subtle contempt that made customers feel small. When had he become someone who used food as a weapon rather than a gift? When had impressing critics become more important than satisfying customers? He'd started cooking because he loved it, loved the alchemy of transforming raw ingredients into something greater than their parts, loved watching people's faces light up when they tasted something delicious, loved being part of the ancient human tradition of gathering around food to celebrate and connect. But somewhere in the pursuit of stars and accolades and empire building, he'd lost sight of that love, had transformed cooking from a joy into a joyless competition where the point was winning rather than giving. Isabel's vision reminded him of why he'd wanted to be a chef in the first place, back before ambition had calcified into arrogance and success had become a trap that left him wealthy but empty. "I want to help you," Isabel said finally, surprising both of them with her decision. "Not because you deserve it, and not because I've forgiven you for how you treated me, but because I love food too much to watch a talented chef destroy himself with pride. And maybe," she paused, considering her next words carefully, "maybe seeing you learn humility will help me let go of some of my own anger about how this industry treats people." The next morning, Julien called an emergency meeting with his entire management team and remaining kitchen staff, the room tense with the anxiety that had permeated Lumiere since the Times review had dropped like a bomb. Dominique arrived perfectly put together, as always despite the crisis, hairstyle, makeup flawless, chef's coat pressed and spotless, but her eyes were tight with stress that no amount of cosmetics could hide. Her suspicion was immediately evident when she saw Isabel sitting beside Julien at the conference table, this former dishwasher somehow occupying a position of importance at a management meeting, and Dominique's jaw clenched slightly as she calculated what this development meant for her own position. "This is Isabel Chun," Julian announced in a room of 12 people. Sous chefs, the executive pastry chef, the sommelier, the general manager, the business manager. She's a Lou Cordon Bleu Paris graduate with experience at Restaurant Land Ducasse, and she's going to help us completely revamp our menu to address the issues identified in the Times Review. He explained her credentials in detail, watching faces shift from skepticism to surprise to grudging respect as they realized this wasn't some random dishwasher, but a seriously trained chef with impressive experience. The room erupted in protests anyway, because restaurant kitchens are feudal hierarchies where status depends on position rather than competence, and accepting direction from someone who'd been washing dishes 3 weeks ago felt like an intolerable disruption to the natural order. The executive sous chef, a 40-year-old man who'd worked his way up through sheer persistence rather than exceptional talent, couldn't believe they were going to take direction from someone who'd been at the bottom of the kitchen hierarchy. The pastry chef, a talented but insecure woman who developed all her desserts to pair with Julian-specific dishes, worried that changes would invalidate months of careful work. The sommelier feared that wine pairings he'd spent years perfecting would no longer make sense with new flavor profiles. Even the line cooks who remained, the ones who hadn't yet jumped ship to competitors, seemed uncomfortable with this dramatic shakeup, preferring familiar disasters they knew to unknown changes that might make things worse. But Julian silenced them all with a look that reminded everyone why he was a chef owner, and they were employees. A look that communicated this decision was final and not subject to committee discussion. "We have exactly 6 weeks before the Michelin Committee does their evaluation visit," Julian said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who decided to bet everything on one last desperate gamble. "If we don't demonstrate dramatic improvement, we'll lose at least 1 star and possibly all 3, which will destroy this restaurant and all of your careers along with mine. Isabel is the most qualified person I know to help us fix our fundamental problems, and if you can't handle taking direction from her, you're welcome to resign immediately, and I'll replace you with people who understand that survival requires humility." The threat was clear, and it worked. Nobody could afford to lose their job in a market where Julian Moreau's former employees would be viewed as tainted by association, so they stayed and nodded and agreed to try, even if their expression suggested they thought this was a terrible idea that would only accelerate the restaurant's collapse. Dominique said nothing during this exchange, but her eyes followed Julian with an intensity that suggested mental calculations happening behind her beautiful face, and her smile when she finally caught his eye was tight and artificial. Over the next week, Isabel worked 18-hour days alongside Julian, arriving at 6 a.m. and leaving after midnight, methodically deconstructing every dish on his menu and rebuilding it with better balance and more thoughtful flavor progression. The famous truffle risotto got a white Weinmeier lemon reduction stirred in at the very end, the citrus acid brightening every component and allowing the natural sweetness of the lobster to shine through the earthiness of the truffle rather than being buried by it. His foie gras torchon, previously served with sweet fig jam that made the whole dish cloying and one-dimensional, was rebalanced with pickled cherries that provided both acid and a touch of bitterness, plus a drizzle of 25-year-aged balsamic that added complexity and tang. The beef Wellington got a horseradish cream that had been punched up with mustard powder and lemon zest, cutting through the richness of the butter puff pastry and beef tenderloin. The butter-poached halibut was garnished with grapefruit supremes and a fennel salad dressed with champagne vinegar. Even the desserts were retooled. The chocolate fondant got a passion fruit sauce. The vanilla panna cotta was served with macerated strawberries and aged balsamic. The fruit tart's pastry cream was infused with lemon verbena. Every change was subtle enough that customers wouldn't feel like they were eating at a completely different restaurant, but collectively they transformed technically competent food into something transcendent. Dishes where every bite sang with perfect harmony of richness and acid, fat and brightness, earth and sky. Julian watched Isabel work with growing admiration that was becoming something more complicated, something that felt dangerously like the beginning of love, but couldn't possibly be that because love didn't happen in a week between 2 people in crisis mode working to save a failing business. She moved through his kitchen with quiet authority that commanded respect through competence rather than fear, teaching rather than yelling, explaining the science and philosophy behind every change so his cooks understood not just what to do but why. His remaining line cooks, the ones who'd stayed loyal or at least hadn't found better offers yet, responded to her with something Julian had never inspired in his own kitchen: genuine enthusiasm. They wanted to learn from her, wanted to understand her approach to flavor balance, wanted to be part of what she was building rather than just executing someone else's vision. Julian found himself in the unprecedented position of being a student in his own kitchen, and instead of feeling diminished by learning from someone else, he felt energized for the first time in years, alive with the same excitement about food that had driven him to become a chef in the first place. Dominique watched it all with growing resentment, her text to Julian going unanswered, her attempt at physical intimacy rebuffed as he worked late with Isabel every night, her position as his fiancée, and sous chef feeling suddenly precarious in ways she couldn't quite articulate but could certainly feel. One afternoon during a brief lull in the relentless work schedule, a small girl appeared at the kitchen's back door. Maybe 7 years old with dark pigtails and a shy smile, wearing a pink t-shirt and light-up sneakers. "Miss Isabel?" she called out tentatively, clearly intimidated by the professional kitchen environment, and Isabel's entire face transformed, lighting up with unguarded joy in a way Julian had never seen during their intense work sessions. "Maria, come here, sweetheart." Isabel crossed the kitchen quickly and scooped up the little girl, spinning her around before setting her down gently and kneeling to be at eye level. "This is Maria," Isabel explained to Julian and the curious kitchen staff who'd paused their work to watch this interaction. "Her mother Teresa owns the Mariposa taco truck, where I work nights. Maria wants to be a chef when she grows up." The little girl nodded enthusiastically, her shyness evaporating in Isabel's presence, clearly comfortable with someone who treated her like her dreams mattered. Julian felt something shift in his chest watching this interaction, watching Isabel with this child, seeing a tenderness and warmth that the professional environment hadn't allowed to surface before now. "Can I help cook something?" Maria asked hopefully, her dark eyes wide with the kind of unfiltered enthusiasm that adults had usually learned to hide, and Isabel looked at Julian for permission rather than making the decision herself, since this was his kitchen. He found himself nodding, surprising himself with how much he wanted to say yes, how good it felt to welcome this child into a space that was usually restricted to trained professionals who could handle the pressure and intensity of fine dining. He watched as Isabel patiently taught Maria how to properly tear basil leaves for a caprese salad. They were testing for the new menu, explaining with genuine respect for the child's intelligence that cutting basil with a knife would bruise the delicate leaves and turn them black, but tearing them by hand released the aromatic oils without damaging the cellular structure. Maria listened with intense concentration that was adorable on someone so young, her small hands careful and precise as she tore each leaf exactly as Isabel had demonstrated, her tongue peeking out slightly in the universal sign of deep focus. When she finished preparing a small bowl of torn basil, Isabel assembled a plate: buffalo mozzarella, heirloom tomatoes, the basil Maria had prepared, extra virgin olive oil, flaky sea salt, and a squeeze of lemon for acid, and let Maria taste the result of her work. "It's perfect," Maria declared with absolute authority, and several of the line cooks smiled despite themselves, charmed by this small person who'd invaded their professional space and somehow made it better through her presence. Isabel caught Julian's eye across the prep station, her expression saying without words, This is why we cook, not for Michelin stars or food and wine awards or Instagram fame, but for moments like this, for the joy of teaching someone who wants to learn, for the satisfaction of creating something beautiful with your hands, for the simple pleasure of sharing delicious food with someone who appreciates it fully and honestly without pretension." Julian felt tears prick his eyes unexpectedly, emotion overwhelming him after weeks of stress and fear and sleepless nights, and he turned away quickly so nobody would see him crying over a 7-year-old girl eating a caprese salad. But Isabel saw, and when he turned back she was watching him with an expression that held understanding and perhaps the beginning of forgiveness. And Julian realized that saving his restaurant was important, but learning to be a better person might actually matter more. Maria stayed for another hour, being fed tiny tastes of various preparations and asking endless questions that Isabel answered with patience and thoroughness. And when Teresa arrived to collect her daughter, Julian found himself inviting them both to be his guests for dinner service that night, wanting to see their honest reactions to the food he was working so hard to fix. The day of Ruth Adler's return visit arrived with the weight of Julian's entire future compressed into a single evening. She'd agreed to re-review Lumiere based on reports from other critics that the menu had undergone significant changes. Everyone in the industry knew that critics rarely reverse harsh reviews because it made them look inconsistent and undermined their authority as tastemakers. Julian's hand shook as he prepped the station that afternoon. Muscle memory carried him through tasks he performed thousands of times while his mind spiraled through worst-case scenarios. Isabel worked beside him at the pass with focused calm that somehow made him feel both better and worse. Better because her confidence was contagious. Worse because her ability to remain centered while he was falling apart highlighted how much stronger she was than him in every way that actually mattered. They decided together that she would work the pass tonight, her trained eye ensuring every plate met her exacting standards for balance and composition before it left the kitchen, her palate providing the final quality check that had been missing from Lumiere's previous operation. Dominique had been unusually quiet all week, her smiles tight, her compliance with the menu changes grudging and minimal, her body language broadcasting resentment that she barely bothered to hide anymore. Julian chalked up the stress and the disruption of having Isabel basically take over her role as his right hand, not recognizing the genuine danger lurking behind his fiancée's perfectly made-up face and cold eyes. The evening service started at exactly 6 p.m., and for the first 90 minutes everything went flawlessly. The kitchen moved like a well-oiled machine, each station executing perfectly, dishes leaving the pass in steady rhythm that felt almost meditative in its precision. Julian and Isabel worked in perfect synchronization. Their nonverbal communication developed over intense weeks of working side by side until they could anticipate each other's needs and movements without speaking. The first courses went out to Ruth Adler's table. She'd been seated at table 9, a prime location with good sight lines, but not so obvious that would make her feel exposed, and Julian watched through the small window in the kitchen door as she tasted each dish with focused attention, her expression professionally neutral as always. The ham and cheese crudo with yuzu and jalapeno earned what looked like an approving nod. The roasted beet salad with goat cheese, pistachio, and sherry vinegar caused her to take a second bite immediately after the first, which every chef knew was the ultimate compliment. Hope built in Julian's chest with each successful course, fragile and terrifying because he never wanted anything as much as he wanted Ruth Adler to reverse her review and give him a second chance. And he knew that kind of desperate wanting made you vulnerable to devastating disappointment. The main courses were plated during the brief orchestrated lull that happened in every well-run kitchen between appetizers and entrees. Julian and Isabel had timed this perfectly, ensuring Ruth Adler's table would receive their signature dishes at the precise moment when the proteins were at optimal temperature and the components had just been assembled. The revised truffle risotto was plated in 3 portions for Ruth Adler's Party 3. Each plate showed the creamy rice glistening with the Meyer lemon white wine reduction that added brightness and acid, the butter-poached lobster sitting prominently on top, showing perfect translucency that indicated ideal cooking, the shaved white truffle applied tableside by their most experienced server for maximum aromatic impact, and the Parmesan crisp adding textural contrast and a touch of salty umami. Isabel inspected each plate with her trained eye, adjusting a microgreen here, wiping a sauce drip there, ensuring absolute perfection before nodding her approval. Julian felt his throat tighten with emotion as the plates headed to the dining room. This was it, the moment that would determine whether his career could be salvaged or was irredeemably destroyed, whether the past 3 weeks of brutal work would pay off or prove insufficient. And then, 30 seconds later, a server came running back to the kitchen, his face pale with panic that immediately told Julian something had gone catastrophically wrong. The risotto, the server gasped, his voice shaking. Something's wrong, really wrong. Table 9 is complaining it's drowning in truffle oil, way too much. They say the smell is overwhelming and they can taste it from across the room. Julian's blood ran cold, his vision actually narrowing at the edges as panic flooded his system, because this was impossible. They'd measured every component of that dish precisely, had triple-checked the truffle oil was being used only as the tiniest finish, literally drops rather than teaspoons, measured with precision that made hospital pharmacies look careless. He rushed to the dining room in violation of every protocol he usually followed. Chefs stayed in the kitchen and let front-of-house handle customers, and found Ruth Adler and her 2 companions pushing their plates away with expressions of obvious disgust. The smell of truffle oil was indeed overwhelming even from several feet away. turning what should have been an elegant dish into something almost nauseating, like someone had dumped an entire bottle of aromatic oil onto the plates and ruined them deliberately. "I apologize profusely," Julian stammered, his carefully prepared professional composure completely shattered. This isn't what we prepared. Something's wrong. Please let us remake this immediately, I promise." But Ruth Adler's face was set in an expression of deep disappointment that was somehow worse than anger would have been, her eyes showing what looked like genuine sadness that he'd failed her low expectations. "Chef Moreau, I came here tonight hoping to see real change, genuine improvement, evidence that you'd learned from criticism and grown as a chef," she said quietly, her voice carrying despite its low volume because everyone in the dining room had stopped talking to listen to this drama unfold. "Instead, I see the same problem taken to an even worse extreme. Still no understanding of balance, still no restraint, just more excess piled on excess. I think we're done here." She stood, her companions following suit, and Julian watched his last chance at redemption literally walk out his restaurant, while the other diners whispered and pulled out their phones to live tweet and Instagram story this disaster in real time. He could already imagine the headlines. "Fallen chef's comeback attempt ends in disaster. Lumiere's new menu somehow worse than before. Ruth Adler walks out of rear view after disastrous dish." Each article another nail in the coffin of his career. Back in the kitchen, chaos had erupted. Line cooks were checking their stations trying to figure out what went wrong. Sous chefs were yelling contradictory orders. And Julian could feel the fragile hope that had sustained them through weeks of brutal work disintegrating into despair that felt like drowning. Isabel stood at the pass examining the truffle oil bottle they'd used, her expression growing darker with each passing second, and Julian recognized that look. It was the same focus intensity she applied analyzing flavor profiles, except now directed at solving a mystery. "Julian, come look at this," she called out with unusual urgency, and he forced himself to move through the chaos to her side, even though his legs felt weak and his hands were still trembling. "This isn't the truffle oil we prep with. Look at the label. It's similar but not identical. This is pure truffle oil, probably 100% concentrate, not the blend we specifically created by cutting premium truffle oil with neutral grapeseed oil for controlled finishing. Someone deliberately swapped it." A cold certainty settled over Julian as he processed what she was saying, looking at the bottle more carefully and seeing that she was absolutely right. The label was similar enough to pass a quick glance, but different enough to be obvious under scrutiny. Someone had sabotaged the most important dish of the most important night of his professional life, had deliberately ensured his failure. And there was only one person in this kitchen with both motive and opportunity. Julian turned slowly to find Dominique standing near the walk-in cooler, her face carefully neutral, but her eyes glittering with something that looked disturbingly like satisfaction mixed with vindication. Isabel saw it too, and before Julian could speak or react, she pulled out her phone and opened the restaurant security camera app that Julian had given her access to weeks ago for inventory management purposes. Her fingers moved quickly, scrolling through footage, searching for evidence of what they both suspected but needed to confirm before making accusations that could never be taken back. The kitchen staff gathered around as Isabel found what she was looking for and played the footage on a large iPad they used for recipe reference, and everyone watched in horrified silence as the truth revealed itself in high-definition color that left no room for doubt or alternative interpretations. The footage was damning. Isabel played on the kitchen's iPad, and the entire staff gathered around to watch Dominique enter the walk-in cooler 20 minutes before service, swapping the carefully prepared truffle oil blend with pure truffle oil, then replacing the bottle exactly where it had been. The timestamp was clear, the action deliberate, and Dominique's face was fully visible. "Why?" Julian asked, his voice hollow with betrayal. His fiancée, his business partner, his sous chef for 5 years. Why would she sabotage the restaurant they'd built together? Dominique's mask finally cracked, her beautiful face twisting with ugly resentment. "Because you were supposed to be mine. My success, my restaurant, my fame. And then this nobody shows up, and suddenly you're working late with her, listening to her, looking at her like she's something special. We were going to lose everything anyway," Dominique continued, her voice rising. "The Times Review destroyed us. At least if tonight failed, we could blame it on your judgment in trusting some random dishwasher instead of your trained staff. I have been there to pick up the pieces. to take over as executive chef when you fell apart completely. But Isabel was still scrolling through security footage, her expression growing more horrified. "Julian, there's more. Look at this," from 3 months ago. The footage showed Dominique meeting with a man in the alley behind Lumiere, handing him a stack of papers. A few clicks revealed the man was Marcus Chun, owner of Zenith, Julian's biggest competitor, a restaurant that had opened a year ago with suspiciously similar dishes to Lumiere's signature offerings. Julian's business manager was called, and within an hour they had the full picture. Dominique had been selling Julian's recipes and techniques to Zenith for $10,000 per month, helping their competitor steal his intellectual property while pretending to be his loyal partner. She'd also been taking kickbacks from suppliers, charging Lumiere premium prices while the suppliers gave her cash rebates. The total damages added up to nearly $200,000 in direct theft, plus potentially millions in lost competitive advantage. Julian's lawyer was summoned, arriving at midnight still in his tennis clothes, and the decision was swift. Dominique would be fired immediately, sued for $5 million in damages, and reported to the Culinary Licensing Board for ethical violations that would end her career permanently. The police arrived to escort Dominique from the building, and she made one last desperate attempt to salvage something. "None of you would have careers without me," she shouted at the assembled kitchen staff. "I trained half of you, gave you opportunities, but the sous chef she'd mentored cut her off with cold finality. You stole from us too, Dominique, shorted our bonuses, took credit for our innovations. We all knew, we just didn't have proof until tonight." The public humiliation was complete as she was let out in handcuffs, not for the sabotage, which was hard to prosecute, but for the clear-cut case of recipe theft that Marcus Chun confirmed with his financial records, hoping to avoid being charged as an accomplice. The kitchen staff watched in silence, and Isabel felt no triumph, just sadness that someone with real talent had destroyed herself through jealousy and greed. But then Julian's phone rang. Ruth Adler. His hand shook as he answered, expecting her to confirm the death of his restaurant. "Chef Moreau, I received your email with the security footage," she said, her voice measured. "Journalistic ethics require me to acknowledge when circumstances beyond your control affected my dining experience. I'm not writing about tonight. Instead, I'll be running a follow-up piece about my lunch at Lumiere yesterday, when I came incognito for the second time and had one of the best meals of my career. Your risotto was perfect. By the way, someone taught you about acid and balance." Julian's legs nearly gave out with relief as Ruth Adler continued. "My full review runs Sunday. I'll be recommending the Michelin committee not just maintain your 3 stars, but seriously consider a 4th. Whatever changes you've made, they're working. Keep doing exactly what you're doing." The kitchen erupted in celebration, cooks hugging each other, champagne appearing from somewhere. Julian found Isabel standing apart from the chaos, her eyes bright with tears she wasn't letting fall. "You did it," she said softly. "You saved Lumiere." But Julian shook his head, moving closer until they were just inches apart. "We did it. No, you did it. You were right about everything, and I was too arrogant to see it until I'd lost almost everything." He wanted to kiss her right then, surrounded by his staff and the remains of the worst and best night of his professional life. But something held him back. The knowledge that Isabel deserved better than being a rebound from his toxic relationship, that she deserved to be chosen deliberately and completely. So instead he took her hand and squeezed it gently, a promise of things to come. 3 months later, Lumiere received its 4th Michelin star, a rare honor that put him among the top 20 restaurants in North America. The ceremony was held at the restaurant itself, with city officials, food writers, and industry legends in attendance. Julian stood at the podium in a custom suit, but his prepared speech died in his throat as he looked at Isabel, who stood at the back wearing an emerald dress that transformed her from kitchen professional to the stunning woman she'd always been beneath the work clothes and exhaustion. "I'm not going to give a speech I wrote," Julian said instead, his voice carrying through the room, "because that speech was about my journey, my vision, my talent. And the truth is that Lumiere's success belongs to someone else. Someone I fired for telling me the truth. Someone I underestimated because of her position rather than seeing her talent. Isabel Chin saved this restaurant and taught me that great food comes from humility, not arrogance." He stepped down from the podium and walked to where Isabel stood, the crowd parting as cameras flashed. "I'm making you co-owner and executive chef of Lumiere, effective immediately," Julian said, pulling legal documents from his jacket pocket. 50-50 ownership, equal decision-making, equal profit share. "I'm also asking you," he dropped to one knee, producing a small velvet box, and Isabel's hands flew to her mouth as gasps echoed through the room. "Isabel Chun, you're the most talented chef I've ever met, the most ethical person I've ever known, and the only woman who's ever made me want to be better than I am. Will you marry me?" The ring was a simple emerald, her birthstone, surrounded by diamonds, elegant without being ostentatious. Isabel nodded, unable to speak, and Julian slipped the ring on her finger before standing and kissing her as the crowd erupted in applause. Little Maria pushed through the crowd, her mother Teresa right behind her, and Isabel scooped her up into a hug. "Did you say yes?" Maria demanded, and Isabel laughed through happy tears. "I said yes, sweetheart." Julian shook hands with Teresa, who'd become like a second mother to Isabel during her months at the taco truck. "You take care of her," Teresa said firmly, though her eyes were warm. "She's special." Julian nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of trust being placed in him. The celebration continued into the early morning hours, with impromptu toasts and kitchen staff telling stories about the dramatic changes of the past months. Julian announced that Isabel would be implementing a new program, training scholarships for aspiring chefs from underserved communities, paid internships instead of unpaid stages, and a commitment to fair wages throughout the organization. 4 months later, they married in a small ceremony at the original Lumiere location, just family and close friends. Isabel wore her grandmother's jade necklace with her white dress. Julian cried during his vows. They honeymooned in Paris, eating their way through the city, and returned to San Francisco with plans for expansion, but not the kind Julian had originally envisioned. Instead of another temple to fine dining, they opened Mariposa in the Mission District, named after Teresa's taco truck, a casual neighborhood restaurant serving elevated comfort food at prices normal people could afford. Isabel ran it while Julian managed Lumiere, and the critics loved the venture, calling it proof that great chefs can be great humanitarians and the most important restaurant opening in San Francisco in a decade. The morning Isabel discovered she was pregnant, she was in the Mariposa kitchen teaching Maria, now 8 and spending every Saturday apprenticing how to make the perfect vinaigrette. Julian arrived with flowers and found his wife explaining the chemistry of emulsions to a rapt child, her hand resting unconsciously on her still flat stomach. "I have news," Isabel said, and Julian knew before she said it, his face splitting into a smile so wide it hurt. They stood in the kitchen where they'd first reconnected, where he'd learned about balance and humility, and kissed while Maria made gagging noises, and the morning prep crew pretended not to watch. 6 months later, their daughter Elena was born, and they threw a party at Mariposa, where the champagne flowed, and Maria insisted on holding the baby first because she'd been waiting the longest. Julian looked around at the mismatched crowd, Michelin-starred chefs and taco truck owners, his family and hers, people from every part of their lives coming together to celebrate, and understood finally what Isabel had tried to teach him. That success wasn't measured in stars or dollars, but in community, connection, and the courage to admit when you've been wrong. They'd built something bigger than a restaurant empire. They'd built a family, a legacy, and a love that had survived ego, betrayal, and the hardest lesson of all, that being right matters less than being kind, and that sometimes the most important ingredient isn't in any recipe book at all.